Hi everyone, this is Sally from ArtiSally, and today I'll be showing you how to make this adorable little penguin. This will be part 1 of my Amigurumi series. Here's an overview of all the materials that I used for this project. If you want a bigger penguin, you can use bulky yarn instead of worsted weight yarn. Also, don't forget to use a crochet hook that's smaller than what your yarn asks for. We start with the head. This pattern is worked from the top down and there will be no need to sew the head to the body as you simply continue with your rounds. Grab onto your gray yarn and make a starting chain. Chain 1. In row 1 we'll put 6 single crochets in the starting chain. This will bring up the stitch count to 6. You use the yarn under method. If you're still a beginner, leave a comment down below, so I'll make a video especially dedicated to the yarn under method and compared to the yarn over method that most people use. For amigurumis, it's better to use the yarn under method to avoid any gaps. Once you are done, you pull the tail to tighten the gap. You place a stitch marker on the last stitch made whenever you end a row, after you counted your stitches, of course. It's time for row 2. In row 2 you increase all around, so you put 2 single crochets in each stitch. You had 6 stitches in the last row, so since you doubled it in this row you'll be left with 12 stitches instead. You keep on using the yarn under method. So you put 2, don't forget to yarn under, put 2 single crochets in each and every stitch. Don't mind my struggle every once in a while. I tend to crochet very tight. So that's 2. And then in the second stitch we also put 2 single crochets like so. And we'll keep on going throughout this entire row. Once you finished your row, you get rid of your stitch marker and put your last 2 single crochets in that stitch where your stitch marker was. So you finish row 2. You put your stitch marker in the last stitch once again, after you counted your stitches. In row 3, we'll be working 1 single crochet in the first stitch and 2 single crochet in the next stitch, so we increase in every second stitch throughout the entire row. You'll be left with a stitch count of 18. Don't forget to use the yarn under method. Once you reach the end of the row, you once again get rid of the stitch marker and finish up your row by putting the last increase in that last stitch. You put your stitch marker back on the last stitch of this row. In row 4, we'll put 2 single crochet in the first 2 stitches, so 1 in each, and then in every third stitch we put an increase, so 2 single crochets in 1. So your pattern calls for 1, 1, 2 across the row. You end up with an increase in the last stitch, and that brings up your stitch count to 24 stitches. Place your stitch marker back in the last stitch made. Row 5 is the first color changing row with white alongside gray. For best results, you finish the single crochet in the next color before every color change. I'll work you through this first row. In row 5, you first put 1 single crochet in the following 3 stitches. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. Then you put an increase in gray, and the last stitch you finish up with white, because that will be your color change. Then with white you put 3 single crochets in the next 3 stitches, so 1 in each. Try to crochet around your tails. Still. Then that's 3. Then you change back to gray, so you finish up the white stitch in gray, and then you start with 1 increase, so 2 single crochets in the following stitch, followed by 1 single crochet in each of the next 3 stitches, and ending with an increase. I accidentally pulled in part of my tail, so I'm frogging this last stitch made. And there we go. So we finish up the gray with an increase, and then we change our color in the last stitch in white. And then you put 3 single crochets in white once more, so 1 single crochet in each of the following 3 stitches. And in the 3rd stitch you finish it off with gray, and you work 1 increase and then 1 single crochet in each of the following 3 stitches, and then 1 increase again. You do this until you end with 1 increase in the last stitch where your stitch marker is. This brings up the stitch count to 30 stitches. Don't forget to keep on using the yarn under method. Sometimes I tend to get a bit lazy and work in my stitch marker, but I really advise you not to do that, because that makes a bigger gap. So now it's time for row 6. In row 6 you'll work 1 single crochet in gray in each of the following 4 stitches, and then you work up 1 increase, it's 4, and then 1 increase, it's 1, it's 2, and you finish it with white. Then you work 4 single crochets in white, 2, 3, the 4th you finish with gray, and you put 1 increase in that stitch right next to the white, it's 1, it's 2, then you work 4 single crochets across the next 4 stitches, and then 1 more increase in gray, finishing it with white, so, and then you work 4 more single crochets in white, and you end it with gray, and then you work 1 increase and 4 single crochets until you reach your stitch marker. Once you reach your stitch marker, you finish off with 1 increase, which brings up your stitch count to 36 stitches. Place your stitch marker back in the last stitch. In row 7 you start up with 5 single crochets in gray and 1 increase. Then you work 5 single crochets in white, we finish the gray first. That's 4. And that's 5. And then we increase. Right above the increase of the last row. After your increase, you'll change to white, like so, and then you'll put 1 single crochet in each of the next 5 stitches. Once you're done with that, you change back to gray, and then you put 1 increase right above the increase of the last row, so 2 single crochets in that stitch, and then we'll put 5 single crochets across the next 5 stitches. 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll put a last increase right above the increase of the last row, change to white, and make 5 single crochets once again. You change back to gray and work 1 increase right above the increase of the last row, and then you'll put 5 single crochets in each of the next 5 stitches, an increase, 5 single crochets once more, and you end with an increase in the place where the stitch marker was. This ends the row, so you move up your stitch marker to the last stitch made, and you start with the next row. In row 8, you'll put 1 single crochet in each of the next 6 stitches in gray. You increase right above the increase of the last row, and then you change to white and put 6 single crochets. Be mindful to finish your stitch right before the color change in the next color. Don't make the same mistake as me. Then you work 1 increase in gray right above the increase of the last row, and then you work 1 single crochet in each of the next 6 stitches, and you end with an increase in gray, changing the color to white. You put 6 single crochets in white once more, so 1 in each of the next 6 stitches, and then you change back to gray. You put an increase right above the increase of the last row, 6 single crochet, an increase, 6 single crochet, and you end with an increase right above the increase of the last row where your stitch marker was. Change the position of your stitch marker, and you go to the next row. In row 9, there are no more increases. You work 8 single crochets in gray, and then you change to white and work 7 single crochets. Then you work 9 single crochets in gray, after changing back to white, you work 7 single crochets in white once again. After your last color change of the row, you work 17 single crochets in gray. This will bring up your stitch count to 48 stitches. Move up your stitch marker and start with the next row. In row 10, you'll start with 8 single crochets in gray. And then you change color to white and work 8 single crochets. After the 8th single crochet in white, you work 8 single crochet in gray again. You change back to white and work 8 single crochets once more. You change back to gray for your last color change of the row and work 16 single crochets. Remove your stitch marker, make your last single crochet, and place your stitch marker in the last stitch. It's time for row 11. In row 11, we'll work 8 single crochets in gray. Then we work 9 single crochets in white. After changing back to gray, you work 7 single crochets. While working in white again, you put 9 single crochets in each of the following 9 stitches. And you simply end the row with 15 single crochets in gray, which should keep your stitch count at 48 stitches. Next up is row 12. In row 12, we'll work 8 single crochets in gray. Then we change color to white and work 10 single crochets. After the 10th single crochet in white, you change back to gray and work 6 single crochets. Keep counting your stitches. Change back to white and work 10 single crochets once more. After the 10th stitch in white, we change back to gray and work 14 single crochets. The stitch count should still remain to be 48. Keep counting your stitches. Next up is row 13. In row 13, you start with working 8 single crochets again. Don't mind the yellow stitch marker in the back. I was working up this pattern as I went, so I needed it, but you will not need more than 1 stitch marker. So keep counting your stitches. Make sure you have 8 single crochets. You should have your color change right before your white stitch of your last row. Then you work 27 single crochets in white. So instead of having 2 patches of white, you'll have 1 instead. This is what it's gonna look like. Then you work 13 single crochets in gray, ending with a stitch count of 48 stitches. So no increases nor decreases yet. Move your stitch marker up and be ready for the next row. In row 14, you'll have a decrease row. You'll start with 6 single crochets in gray. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then you decrease by crocheting 2 single crochets in 1. You change your color to white and you work 6 single crochets. Sometimes I also lose count. You decrease after your 6th stitch and then you work 6 more single crochets. You decrease once more and then you work 4 single crochets in white. and change your color back to gray. You work 2 single crochets, you decrease once, you work 6 single crochets, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then you do your last decrease. This will bring down your stitch count to 42 stitches. Place your stitch marker on your last stitch made and be ready for the next row. In row 15, we start with 5 single crochets in gray, then 1 decrease, changing color to white and working 5 single crochets, decreasing once, 5 single crochet once again, decreasing once more, 5 single crochets once more, decreasing for the last time, and putting 5 single crochets, and then change to the color gray. In gray, you will start with a decrease, then you work 5 single crochets and end with a decrease. If it's going too fast, you could either adjust the speed of this video, or you could pause it and check the description above the footage. You could also leave a comment down below with any specific questions. After your last decrease of this row, you'll end up with 36 stitches as your stitch count. Move up your stitch marker. In row 16, you'll start with 4 single crochets in gray, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you decrease once. Finish your stitch with white, in which you'll make 4 single crochets, 1, 2, 3, and 4, decreasing once, 4 more single crochets, keep on tucking or pulling your tail, gray tail a bit to keep it nice and tight. Then you decrease, 4 more single crochets, another decrease, then you put 4 more single crochets in white and end with a decrease. Change it back to gray, and then you work 4 single crochets and end this entire row with a decrease. Your stitch count should be 30 by now. Next up is row 17. You'll start with 3 single crochet in gray. And then you decrease in gray, finishing the stitch with white. And then you put 3 single crochet in white and decrease. There we go. Put 3 more single crochet next to the decrease. 1, second stitch, 2, and a third, and then you decrease once more. You put 3 more single crochet down, 2, 3, you decrease once more. Keep on doing the same until you reach your last decrease in white, and then you add 1 more single crochet, change to the color gray, and work 2 single crochets and finish up this row with 1 decrease. You'll have a stitch count of 24 by now. Move your stitch marker up and start with row 18. In row 18, we'll start with 2 single crochets in gray, 1, 2, we decrease once, and finish the stitch with white. And then you put 2 single crochets in white, after which you decrease. You put 2 more single crochets in white, decrease once more, you place 2 more single crochets, decrease again, two more single crochets, our last decrease in white, and then 2 more single crochets. You change the color to gray. You put 1 decrease in gray, and that marks the end of the row. You will be left with 18 stitches. We finally finished the head. We'll start with the neck now. This is only 1 row. In row 19, you'll work 8 single crochets in gray, and you work in the front loop only. By doing this, you'll create somewhat of an edge which separates the body from the head. So 8 single crochet. You still use the yarn under method and you work in the front loop only. So finish up that last 8th gray stitch, change to white, and then put 5 single crochets in white, and you still use the same methods, so yarn under and front loop only. Once you've finished your 5th stitch in white, you change to gray and you put 5 single crochets in the front loop only, which marks the end of the row. After removing your stitch marker, you work your last stitch. You place your stitch marker back. It's time to stuff the head. You'll be needing polyfill or any other filling material to fill the head. You fold the filling material. Make sure that your stitch is well kept. And then you simply push your filling inside the head. What I like to do is create a hole in the middle by pushing the filling material to the sides, and then every other filling I add accordingly, I push in that hole I just made. You should not overfill it. However, you should also not underfill it. The shape should be nice and round, but not too hard. Pinch the head to feel whether it's nice and cuddly. Naturally, that's what we're going for. We can start with the body now. It starts with row 20. In row 20, we put 2 single crochets in gray in the following 2 stitches. So that's 1 and 2. Then we increase once. We put 2 single crochets in the following 2 stitches, so 1 in each. We increase once more, and then you put your last 2 single crochets in gray. Change to white. Start with 1 increase in white, so 2 single crochets in 1 stitch. Then you put 1 single crochet in each of the following 2 stitches, followed by an increase, and then you add 2 more single crochets and change back to gray. Then you increase once with gray, work 2 separate single crochets in the next 2 stitches, and end with an increase. We've reached row 21. In row 21, you'll start with the colored gray once more, and you put 3 single crochets in, followed by an increase right above the increase of the last row. You then put 3 more single crochets in the next 3 stitches, followed by an increase, and you end with 2 single crochets in gray. After those 2 single crochets in gray, you start with white again. You start with 1 single crochet, followed by an increase. As you can see, it's right above the increase of the last row. You then put 3 single crochets once more, and then increase once. You end with 3 single crochets in white. It's 2, and that's 3. Then you change color, and while working with gray, you put in 1 increase right above the increase of the last row. There we go. followed by 3 single crochets, and you end this row with an increase. Your stitch count is now 30. It's time for row 22. In row 22, you start with 4 single crochets, so 1 single crochet in each of the following 4 stitches. You increase, and then you put 4 more single crochets in gray, followed by another increase, ending with 2 single crochets and changing color. In white, you will put 2 single crochets in the following 2 stitches. You increase right above the increase of the last row. You put 4 more single crochets in the next 4 stitches. You increase once more. And then you put 4 single crochets in each of the following stitches. This is what it's going to look like. You can see the back loop of the neck. By having worked through the front loop only, you have created a curve that separates the body from the head. Let us not get too distracted and finish with our white. 1 more single crochet, change color, then we increase in gray in the first stitch. We put 1 single crochet in each of the following 4 stitches, and in the stitch where the stitch marker is, we place our last increase, which ends the row. You'll be left with a stitch count of 36. Let's start with row 23. In row 23, you'll work 5 single crochets, 1 increase, 5 more single crochets, 1 last increase, and 2 single crochets in gray. Then you'll change your color. Once you changed your color and you're working in white, you work 3 single crochets. You increase once, put 5 single crochets, increase once more, and place 5 single crochets once again. Once you changed back to gray, you start with 1 increase. Then you put 1 single crochet in each of the next 5 stitches, and you end the row with 1 increase. You'll be left with a stitch count of 42. We'll move to row 24 now. In row 24, there are no more increases. You work 16 single crochets in gray, followed by 18 single crochets in white, and you end with 8 single crochets in gray. Your stitch count remains the same. You'll be left with 42 stitches. In row 25, you'll start with 16 single crochets in gray, followed by 19 single crochets in white, and ending with 7 single crochets in gray. Your stitch count will remain the same. You'll be left with 42 stitches. In row 26, you'll put 17 single crochets in gray, followed by 18 single crochets in white, and you end with 7 single crochets in gray. You'll remain to have 42 stitches as your stitch count. In row 27, you'll make 18 single crochets in gray, followed by 17 single crochets in white, ending with 7 single crochets in gray. You'll be left with 42 stitches once again. Row 28 is a decrease row. You'll start with 5 single crochets in the color gray, followed by a decrease, followed by 5 more single crochets, and then another decrease, and then 5 single crochets once more, and then a color change. In the color white, you start off with 1 decrease, like so. And then you work up 5 single crochets, make sure you keep counting. Then you decrease, put 5 more single crochets, and you put in your last decrease in white before you change color. In the color gray, you work up 5 single crochets and end with a decrease. This marks the end of the row. The stitch count has gone down to 36. In row 29, you work 4 single crochets and 1 decrease. You do that 3 times in total. So that's the first, and then you do 2 more. And then when you switch to white, you make 4 single crochets and 1 decrease. And you do this 1 more time. So you have 4 single crochets, 1 decrease, and then 4 more single crochets and 1 decrease, and then you change your color. After you changed your color, you work 4 single crochets and then you decrease, which is the last stitch of this row. You'll have a total stitch count of 30. Next up is row 30. In row 30, you start with 3 single crochets, 1 decrease, 3 single crochets once more, another decrease, 3 single crochets, 1 decrease, and you end with 1 single crochet in gray, and you change your color. In white, you work 2 single crochets, 1 decrease, 3 single crochets, and end with a decrease. And then lastly in gray, you put 3 single crochets and end the row with a decrease. You'll be left with a stitch count of 24. In row 31, you'll put 2 single crochets, 1 decrease, 2 single crochets, another decrease, 2 more single crochets, the last decrease in gray, followed by 2 single crochets, So in fact you do the 2 single crochets, 1 decrease 3 times, and you end with 2 single crochets. After which you'll put a decrease in white, followed by 2 single crochets, and end with a decrease. And then in gray again, after your color change, you work 2 single crochets and end the row with a decrease. You'll be left with a stitch count of 18. And this is the ideal moment to start stuffing your body. I did it later on, which gave me some difficulty. In row 32, you'll work in the color gray only. You'll start with 1 single crochet, 1 decrease, 1 more single crochet, 1 decrease, 1 single crochet. And what I did here, after this decrease, is I grabbed my scissors and I cut the white yarn. This way it's hidden well underneath my stitches, and I don't have to be afraid of it untying anytime soon. I continued this row by doing 1 single crochet and 1 decrease until my stitch marker. Row 33 marks the last row of your body. You will put a decrease all around, which brings your stitch count down to 6. I tried to stuff my body after this row, but that is simply impossible. That's why I advised you to do so 2 rows ago. You simply decrease in every 2 stitches, so you'll have 6 decreases. And you'll end up with 6 stitches. I do not do so in this pattern, but you could add 1 more row of single crochets around to have a nicer finish. I didn't mind it because I would put the feet underneath anyway, but you could choose to do so. There's no harm in that. It would actually be better. Now cut your yarn, leaving a tail for sewing. You pull up that loop like this by making a chain, and this way it's secured. Your head and your body are finished in one go. Now what's left is making the arms, the feet, the beak, and sewing the eyes. I'll show you how to do each and every one of those things. Let's start with the beak. I am using yellow yarn for this. You could use any color you'd like your penguin to have for a beak and feet. Make a starting chain and chain 1. Then you start with your first row. You work 6 single crochets in the starting chain. I'm using the yarn under method, but frankly it doesn't really matter whether you use the yarn under or the yarn over method, since you won't be stuffing these parts. Once you've finished your first row, you put your stitch marker up and you pull the tail to tighten the gap just like you did with the head. Let's go to row 2. In row 2, we'll work 1 single crochet and 1 increase throughout the entire row. So you start with your first single crochet, and then in the second stitch you put 2 single crochets in one stitch. This is your increase. You keep on going until you reach your stitch marker. After this row, you'll be left with a stitch count of 9. It's time for row 3. In row 3 you simply single crochet around, ending with a stitch count of 9, just like we had in the last row. You will do this for row 4 and 5 as well. After row 5, this is what you'll end up with. I like to check the progress by putting it against my penguin, and I was content, so I continued with the next part. You cut your yarn, and then instead of chaining 1, you simply pull your tail. It's time to work on the feet. For the feet, we'll use the same color as we used for the beak. In my case, it's the color yellow. Make a starting chain and chain 3. It's 2. And that's 3. You work 3 single crochets in the first chain from the hook. It's 2. That's 3. And then you work 1 single crochet in the next, and you work 5 single crochets in the starting chain. Once you've finished 5 single crochets in the starting chain, you work on the other side of the stitches. You work 1 single crochet and you end with 2 more single crochets in the chain where you already worked 3 single crochets. Once you've finished those 2, after this row you'll be left with 12 stitches. Don't forget your stitch marker. In row 2, you single crochet around. You'll be left with a stitch count of 12. It's time for row 3. In row 3, you'll start with a decrease. Then you'll work 5 single crochets. Then you'll decrease once more and end with 3 single crochets. After this row, you'll be left with a stitch count of 10. In row 4, you'll start with a decrease once again. After which, you'll put 3 single crochets along the next 3 stitches. Then you decrease once more. and you end this row with 3 more single crochets. Your stitch count will be 8. In row 5, you'll start with a decrease once again. Then you'll work 2 single crochets. You'll decrease once more. And you'll end the row with 2 single crochets. You'll be left with a stitch count of 6. In row 6, there will be no decreases. You'll simply single crochet in each and every stitch throughout the entire row. You'll be left with 6 stitches once again as your stitch count. Once you're finished with row 6, you'll follow the same steps for a second foot. Let's move to the wings. For the wings, we'll be needing the same color as we used for the body. In my case, this was gray. Make a starting chain and chain 1. Then you'll work 6 single crochets in the starting chain. You'll end up with a stitch count of 6 in row 1. In row 2, you'll increase in each and every stitch around. So you'll put 2 single crochets in every stitch in this row. You'll end up with a stitch count of 12. In row 3, you'll put a single crochet in each and every stitch around. You'll end up with the same stitch count of 12. You'll do the same for rows 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Make sure your stitch count remains the same. It's time for row 9. In row 9, you'll single crochet in the next 2 stitches. Then you'll decrease once. You'll single crochet in each of the following 3 stitches. And you decrease once more. You'll end the row with 3 more single crochets. Your stitch count will be 10. In row 10, you'll single crochet around. So you'll put 1 single crochet in each and every stitch. Your stitch count will continue to be 10. Follow the same steps for the second wing to make sure they're equally as big. Now it's time for sewing and the final touches. We'll start with the wings. Get your tail in your yarn needle. And I'll be starting with the left wing. I'll be placing my wing right underneath where my white ends. I hope this video is clear enough to show you where I'm gonna sew it in. Naturally, it's your own choice, but I found this to be the right spot. You sew it in, like so, going through both stitches in the front and the back. You'll move to your second stitch and you'll sew it right next to where you just gone through. And with your yarn needle, you'll keep on going in the same way. So go through both stitches and then through your body. Pay close attention to the video. Replay it if something is not clear. Make sure your tail does not go around your wing. This is how it's looking like right now. Your left wing is attached. Now let's move to the right wing. You can see that instead of starting in the back, we start in the front, right next to where our white starts in our body. So you once again go through both stitches and then through the body. Go through both stitches and then you go through that stitch right next to where your tail ended. You keep on going in the same way. You can see how perfectly aligned they are. Could almost think that penguins can actually fly this way. Now it's time to sew the beak. You get your yarn needle around the tail of the beak, and I liked to work this way So my tail went to the right. Pay close attention to how I'm sewing it in. I like to align it first to see where I want it to come exactly. So I place my yarn needle right next to that last gray stitch. And it might look a bit crooked at first, but you'll see where I'm going once I've finished with the beak. Go through both stitches once again, pull tight, and work on the next stitch on the head. Go through both stitches again. And go through the stitches on the head. If you go through both stitches, you'll make sure that the part stays flat. Also, it makes it more secure this way. Don't forget about that last stitch in the end. And go through that last gray stitch on your head by pulling your yarn through and pull tight. This is what it looks like. Secure the beak by going through different stitches. Do go back to the very beginning, making sure that part is tightly stitched as well. For now, this is the end result. We're going to sew in the ends at a later point. We can now start with sewing the feet. Once again, you get your tail in your yarn needle, and then you place your foot underneath the body to get an image on where you want them to come. I like to put them right next to where my tail is, my body. And then first I go through the end stitches. To have more flexibility. Pull tight. This is what it looks like. Grab the second one. Get your yarn needle in. Try to align them mirrored. And pay close attention to where to place your needle. Go through those last two stitches again. And pull tight. Once you are happy with the position, you can start sewing it in for more security. I like to check first to see whether I'm content with it. Once you're content with the way it looks, you can secure the feet by going through different stitches. I like to go up for a row or two. So push the feet onto the body and then go through your stitches, both through the body and through the feet. Don't forget to keep on pulling tight. You can also sew both feet at the same time, which is what I'm doing right now. Keep on going until the feet are secure enough. Once you're done, you'll be left with quite some tails. This is what it's gonna look like, however. We can now move on to the eyes. I placed some safety eyes in my penguin to see where I want my eyes to be. I placed them in between the 10th and the 11th row, and I kept them 3 white stitches from the middle gray part. I didn't use safety eyes, but if you like the view with the safety eyes, you should place the safety eyes before you stuff the head. I, however, like to use my yarn, my black yarn. So I'm getting my black yarn in my yarn needle. I'm removing the safety eye. And I'm placing my yarn needle right next to where my safety eyes I was just now. I'm going around 1 stitch only. I'm working around the 4th stitch from the middle in white. So if you look at gray being the edge, it's the 4th stitch from the edge. You keep on working your black yarn till you have something like that. You work your yarn away by going through the same stitch as where you came out of and bringing it to the middle. Adjust position of your eye. You cut the tail on the other side. And you work that tail away in the same manner. Always go through stitches, so in between stitches. Don't split a stitch in the middle because then it won't look that neat. You will work the eye on the right side in the same way. You use the yarn that you just brought to the middle. You come out where your safety eye just was. I counted the stitches to be sure. Just make sure that it's symmetrical. Doesn't matter whether you put your eyes higher or lower, as long as it's symmetrical. So it should be on the same height on both sides. And you should work your yarn through an equal amount of times. So once you're done with that, you bring your yarn away by going through the same stitch. And this is what it looks like. You could leave it like this, or make bigger eyes like I did, which I'll be showing you in just a second. I made the eye on the right side already. Show you how to do the left side now. You go down one stitch, as you can see, and you go up a stitch. So in total, you're covering 3 stitches. Earlier, you were working in horizontal, always crisscross, and now you're working up and down, so vertically. Pull tight, but not too tight. Keep on going in the same way. My tail got too short, so I grabbed more yarn. Once you're done, you kept on going up and down. This is what you're gonna end up with. You have lots of tails on your body right now, so it's time to sew in the tails. You simply go through the stitch where you came from, and then you work it through the head several times. Because you go through the stuffing, it's already secure enough if you go through it for like 3 times. Once you worked all your tails through your body or your head, you can cut your yarn close to the body or head. I'll post a separate video on how to crochet the hat and scarf. If you enjoyed watching this video, please like and share it, and don't forget to leave a comment down below. Please subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next one.